Welcome. My name is Brian Turnbull, and I'm privileged and honored to be the mayor of the city of Northville. My family goes back 5 generations in this community. One grandfather was the barber in Northville, the other one the electrician. My father, for most of his 98 years, was the town historian. I've grown up hearing the stories from my grandparents and especially my parents about this hamlet in the hill or Switzerland of Wayne County that we call home. This program today highlights the lives of some of the Norfolk pioneers, which you may or may not know, but I bet you know their names from the street signs that you pass each and every day. Oakwood Cemetery, also called Katy Street Cemetery, is truly a historical treasure in town, with 35 veterans resting there each and every day, 24 from the Civil War alone. The first 3 profiles that we're going to look at are from the cemetery tour. Let's take a look from those.
Good day. I'm Dr. Julia Maria Durfee with a practice in the Grand Circus area of Detroit. I'm unusual in that I'm an unmarried woman who owns her own home, business, premises, and medical practice. I was born in Livonia Township in 1829, eldest of 3 daughters of Barton and Phoebe Bowen Durfee. The family came to Northville in the early 1850s, where father farmed. I was still living at home at the age of 32 when war broke out. How did I become a doctor? In my era, 90% of the doctors were trained by apprenticing to other doctors. There were no national requirements or licensing. Michigan was one of only 3 states with formal certification, and I was good enough to earn a certificate. The other states, I shudder to think about it. Why did I become a doctor? Some said my independent nature. Others, my unwomanliness and selfishness. But I say the Civil War was the greatest influence, along with the loss of my sister, Anne Eliza, at the age of 21. To understand this, you have to understand the effect of war had on Michigan and me. Nearly a quarter of Michigan's male population served in the Civil War. Roughly 1 of every 6 of them died, and 2/3 of these deaths were due to disease. Michigan's losses were 6th highest among the northern states. Then there were the wounded and amputees and those suffering from the after effects of various diseases and psychological problems. We didn't have names for or even understand all the problems our soldiers had. We just knew that after the war, many of our friends, relatives, and neighbors were never the same. I would never lack for work if they were willing to be treated by a woman doctor. Why were the losses so great? Many important medical discoveries were yet to be made. We didn't know about germs or how diseases were spread. Surgery was performed with dirty instruments, and antibiotics had yet to be developed. And neither side was prepared for the staggering number of casualties. When Walt Whitman arrived at a military hospital to nurse his brother, his first sight was of a heap of feet, legs, arms, and human fragments, cut, bloody, black and blue, swelled and sickening, piled outside the hospital. Used bandages littered the floor, and doctors moistened stitching thread with their saliva before sewing wounds, and sharpened surgical knives on the soles of their boots. Bedpans were left unemptied, and the wounded lay on rotten straw. Nurses? Nursing was done by convalescent soldiers too ill to go back to fighting. Before being shipped to these hospitals, the wounded were treated in field hospitals, set up in tents, barns, houses, anywhere with access to water. The wounded lay on hay or bare ground, waiting their turn on the operating table, usually a flat surface between 2 barrels. 3/4 of the operations were amputations, which usually took 15 minutes and had a mortality rate of 25% if done within 24 hours, 50% in 48 hours. Anesthesia, a recent discovery, was used in less than 20% of operations. The images you've seen of men being held down biting on pieces of wood with their senses deadened by liquor must have occurred. You would think that soldiers would be safer in camp than in battle or in the hospital, but they weren't. In the beginning, the higher-ups were mainly concerned with getting enough bodies trained and to the front. The typical camp, with its crowded conditions, lack of safe drinking water, inadequate or undercooked rations, cornmeal and hardtack fried in pork grease, lack of adequate clothes, blankets, and shelter became a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, malaria, smallpox, whooping cough, pneumonia, scurvy, tuberculosis. The list goes on, as did the argument over whose job it was to oversee camp sanitation. Individuals and groups like the ones Mrs. Mosher told you about badgered the government into creating the U.S. Sanitary Commission. They were separate from the regular Army Medical Corps, and their mission was to unify the volunteer aid groups across the northern United States, which it did. But it took 2 years. The key thing, though, is that ultimately they did provide centralized oversight to thousands of volunteer groups. Unfortunately for the South, its aid groups continued to function individually, another factor in the South's greater suffering and losses. After the war, the commission evolved into the American Red Cross. I spent more than 30 years practicing medicine in Detroit, where there was plenty of work for all, even a woman doctor.
Good evening, I'm Lester Lyke. I was born in Novi in 1843. I was one of 8 children born to Alexander and Emmeline Lyke. Mother produced 5 strong sons to help on the family farm.
And I'm Nellie Dodge, also born in Novi in 1866. I wasn't around for the war, so I'll let Lester tell you about that.
Thank you, my dear. My brother Jeremiah served with me in Company C, the 30th Michigan Infantry. We were late to the party, joining in November of 1864. Of course, Jeremiah was only 17 at the time, so he couldn't have taken him any sooner. This regiment was raised to guard our border from Canadians sympathetic to the South and refugee rebels who fled to Canada. We were worried about raids across the border, but they never materialized. Not a single shot was fired in anger, though we did lose 17 men to disease and accident. Our company was stationed in Detroit. Many soldiers brought musical instruments from home to pass the time at camp. Banjos, fiddles, and guitars were particularly popular. Music was so important in the Civil War that in May of 1861, the United States War Department officially approved that every regiment of infantry and artillery would have a brass band of 24 members, and a cavalry regiment would have one of 16 members. In addition, the Union Army required every company to have 2 musicians. But as the war dragged on, riflemen were more needed than musicians, and the numbers fell. While we enjoyed the entertainment, and it did pass the time waiting for something, anything to happen, music had a serious side as well. Buglers were critical in the war because they were responsible for sounding out commands. They had to learn 49 separate calls just for infantry, and cavalry needed more. They ranged from reveille in the morning, battle commands such as advance and retreat, to calls for mealtime. Buglers were given greater importance than drummers.
Some of the drummers were not even in their teens.
Drummers had to learn 38 different beats, 14 for general use and 24 for marching cadence. Drum beats told soldiers what to do and kept them in step. Drum calls issued commands to soldiers, while other drum beats, along with the fife, helped soldiers march. The shrill tone of the fife could be heard well above the rumblings of cannon and other noises on the battlefield. Not that I know anything about that.
I learned in school that musicians would leave the battlefield to help doctors by carrying amputated arms and legs and stretchers. Cooks did too.
Musical duels between the two sides were common. They could hear each other as the music traveled across the countryside. The night before the Battle of Stones River, bands from both sides dueled with separate songs until both sides started playing Home Sweet Home. Soldiers on both sides started singing together as one. I've heard stories like this many times, though I can't say I heard it firsthand. The first song written for the war, The First Gun is Fired, was published and distributed just 3 days after the Battle of Fort Sumter. Its writer, George F. Root, is said to have produced the most songs of anyone about the war, over 30 in total. Lincoln once wrote a letter to Root saying, "You've done more than 100 generals and 1,000 orders."
After the war, his brother Jeremiah was working in a foundry in Kalamazoo where he was accidentally killed by a bursting wheel. They were able to draw a pension for his new babe and his young wife because of his service. I don't know what they would have done without that.
In 1869, I married Sarah Dodge, a lovely girl barely 17. We lived in Novi and had 5 children. Sarah was just 33 when she died of blood poisoning less than a month after our daughter Iva was born. 8 years later, I married Sarah's little sister Nellie. She was a fine young woman and gave me another 6 children. She was a bit of a fighter.
One day, after Lester had gone off to work, a tramp came to the door wanting some food. When I turned to get it, he forced his way into the house. And, of course, I resisted, and he knocked me down. So I reached on the shelf and got my revolver, and I started shooting, and he took off. I must be a pretty good shot, because every time I shot, he fell. But he managed to get away, disappeared into the woods. Wasn't the first time I used this revolver. Another time, 2 men were trying to steal our chickens from the chicken coop. I started shooting and they took off, lickety-split.
Poor Nellie, she died young too, just 41. I didn't remarry after Nellie passed. 3 of my children continue to live with me, including Ruby.
Papa, tell him about the fire.
Our home burned one night a couple of years ago. It started upstairs when we were sleeping. We all managed to escape with our lives, but lost everything. The GAR, along with our friends and neighbors, helped us through. I lived a full life and was 75 when I passed on in 1918. Thanks for coming by to visit.
Asa Randolph. Mrs. Chapman said I used to come down to the cemetery and reminisce. She was right. I thought, and I reflected. And as the sun set, there were days I would swear I could hear the crack of rifles, the thunder of cannon, screams of men. Smell of gun smoke. I didn't fight in the war, but I saw it in the faces of the wives and the mothers. I could tell if their sons were in battle or if they died, just by their faces. But that's another story. Yeah. I was born in New York, like most of the folks here in the cemetery. I came at a young age. In fact, I never celebrated a birthday anywhere other than Michigan. The folks settled on a farm just northeast of here, between what's now known as Northville and Farmington. Worked the land and moved from there to the baseline, a place called the Shaw Farm. Then in 1835, we moved to town. We joined 26 other houses, 100 or so souls there in Northville. That was the year my mother died. Maybe we moved there to make it easier. Farm life is tough. I was a busy boy. I worked in a dry goods store, Wilcox, Charles. Then Lapham's. Worked in the general store. Set up my own drugstore. Became a dentist. I could play a clarinet, a flute, play the piano, a violin. I was one of 2 pianos in town. In fact, I was the only person that could repair them. I fell in love. The girl was named Diana Gardner. Oh, she was beautiful. Blue-eyed. When she was embarrassed, she became flushed. Her skin sort of blotted. I could tell if she was embarrassed or aroused. We had 2 daughters, Arabella and Antoinette, lovely girls. In fact, Arabella, after Diana passed, took care of me. Good long life. Lived to be 92. Well, my drugstore was the place where people talked. It was right beside the post office. People would come out with letters, sometimes explaining what was going on in the war. Other times, letters from the War Department that explained something else. We'd share those letters. We'd share the stories from the news, and people gather around. In fact, it was called the Veranda Club. Like a rock in the river for me. Pulls up to that rock and picks up speed. Pulls behind it. Eddies for a second. And drifts off downstream. The story of Asa Randolph.
Norfolk has a long-standing tradition of award-winning schools. In the next accounts, we're going to hear from a teacher, a student, and a businessman who made fine furniture for the classrooms all around this country. He made it right here in Northville, Michigan. The latest Norfolk High School class wasn't really the first one to have a notable graduation, as you'll see. Let's hear from those who lived the history.
Young scholars. My name is Stephen L Gage. I was born in 1809 in central New York, not far from the future route of the Erie Canal. Upon its completion, or after its completion, I, like many in my state, immigrated to Michigan Territory. And it was there that I married another New Yorker, Mary Aldrich, in 1836, and I had 4 sons and a daughter. Prior to 1830, there were very few free public schools other than outside of New England. Though children learned to read and write in various degrees of proficiency at home or in Sunday school. But in 1833, a meeting was called to build a public school at the corner of Main and Hutton Streets, and it was to be of cobblestone, 80 by 24 feet, and accommodate 100 students. I was its first teacher. I worked every day except Sundays, and I earned about between $1 and $2 per week. And yes, those were the days when the lines of education and corporal punishment often crossed, and teachers were expected to whip or flog students who made noise or wiggled in their seats or paid little attention. Also in 1830s, there was a song that kind of seemed to fit my calling. Is it not a cruel fate, a master thus to be, doomed to teach such naughty boys, such poster heads as me? Letters telling, hard word spelling, reading, writing, scolding, fighting, coaxing on the stubborn ones, pushing on the lazy. Now, toward the end of my teaching career, Horace Mann of Massachusetts published a report in the Public School Journal suggesting that children under the age of 10 or 12 could be more successfully governed by a female rather than male teacher. Females, he said, were less often resorted to physical appliances and exerted more genial and refining influence upon their students, and this turned to be the truth as over a 6 to 8 year trial period, and apprehension that female teachers employed too little strength to govern their children or students soon dissipated. In 1843, I was among several nominated to represent the Whig Party. Our hero, William Henry Harrison, had been elected 3 years earlier, but died only a month after taking office. His vice president, John Tyler, who we refer to as this accidency, proved to be a great disappointment to Whig Party members, and we prepared instead to support Henry Clay and Theodore Frelinghuysen for the election of 1844. Tyler says that he's the man to cure the spreading evil. People all will vote for him to go down to the devil. Come boys, help me sing the song, workmen are arising. Every Whig will sing and shout for Clay and Frelinghuysen. Of course, we were very disappointed when Democrat Jimmy Polk instead won that election, and before his inauguration, I died and was brought over here. I had been gone for over 80 years when an article in the Northville Record remembered me as a wonderfully good instructor. And this was a reliable testimony, as it was made by the only remaining resident who remembered me, my son David. Now, he was only 5 years old when I died, but we raised him to be observant, forthright, and honest. Thanks for that.
Benjamin Bale, 1818 to 1869, was a cabinet maker who married his brother's widow, Rachel. Their daughter, Alice, was the first graduate of Northville High School. Rachel's son, Francis, made his mark as president of the Globe Furniture Company and lived at 542 West Dunlap.
My name is Rachel Lyte Bale. I was born in 1817 in New Hampshire, and I came to Michigan with my husband, James. We had 5 children together. My husband died in 1845, and I was forced to take in boarders, one of which was Benjamin, the brother of my late husband. And yes, we married in 1856, and we owned the half block on the south side of Dunlap between West and Linden. We had one child, Alice, who was anxious to talk to all of you.
Hi, I'm Alice Bale. Call me Allie. I had the distinction of receiving the first diploma ever awarded in Northville as the only person in my graduating class in 1869. I graduated a month after my father died, and a year later, I became a teacher in the Union School. In 1874, the school hired a new principal, Professor Nathan Collins of Union City. After school began, he wrote the Parents and Northville Record about the overcrowding and punctuality. He said parents would be required to write notes to excuse absence and tardiness. As an extra incentive, he offered a chromo, or colored lithograph, to hang in the classroom with the best attendance and punctuality. It would move monthly, and at the end of the year be awarded to the classroom that had the best record for the year. Oh, I thought him very clever. As time went on, Professor Collins, and I started keeping company. We wed in 1877 and moved to Calhoun County, lived with his parents, where Nathan resumed his life as a farmer. A year later, we had a son, Arthur. When he was 10 years old, while we were living in Florida, he fell and broke his arm and went into shock. And died. I was overwhelmed with grief and mourned him until I passed away from consumption 2 years later, at the age of 40 in 1891. You will find us both buried at Rural Hill. Oh, anything else, Mother?
Oh, no, my dear. They know all they need to know. That was quite a history. My son Francis was only 9 when his father died. He learned the cabinet maker's trade when he was just 14 years old, and he owned a hardware store after that.
Mother, I'll tell you about the night the burglars tried to rob my store. They succeeded in breaking off the hinges of the safe door, but couldn't get it open. So they tried to turn the safe over and get access through the bottom, but it slipped from its blocks to the floor, making such a noise that it woke up Mr. Northrop, who sleeps upstairs. He scared them off, and they jumped through 3 large panes of glass in the front window. Those rascals must have been badly cut, as blood was sprinkled all over the sidewalk. All the tools they left behind were stolen from Haley and Hirsch's blacksmith shop. I married Sarah Ayers from New York in 1856 when I was 20. We had 3 children. I built 3 houses on Dunlap Street, and we lived at 542. I owned many businesses, but most well-known of all was the Michigan School Furniture Company, which made the first school desk with a curved back. We had orders from all over the world. The name of the company was changed to Globe Furniture, and by 1895, we employed 250 men and had a payroll of $1,000 per week. I was president and manager until I retired. I was good to my workers and built them houses with contracts practically at cost, with low interest. My weekly payments were deducted from their wages. You have heard of Bealtown, which is the area north of 7 Mile and was west of Northville Road.
Oh, I'm so proud of you, Francis. You've left a wonderful heritage. My husband Benjamin died in 1869 from consumption at the young age of 52. He is buried here with 2 of my children. I followed in 1895 at the age of 78, but I'm buried in Rural Hill, and I don't really know why we can't all be here together.
Poor Mother, I miss her. I hope you don't think I'm boasting, but I also owned Columbia Refrigerator and the American Bell Foundry. You can see and ring one of the bells in the parking lot near the bridge at Mill Race. I was active in local politics, in the school board, and the Methodist Church. In 1885, when the Methodists built a new church, practically everything used in its construction was made in Northville: lumber, brick, pews, furniture, and the organ. It was considered one of the finest churches outside of Detroit, and it still stands today at the corner of Dunlap and Center, but is now the Stamp Peddler Plus. After Sarah died, I moved to my little fruit farm east of town in 1911. I died in Detroit in 1923 at the age of 87 and buried at Rural Hill with most of my family. Thank you for listening.
Our last pair of presentations portray business owners in town. Norfolk was home for many industries over the years: furniture, sparkling water, condensed milk, bells, and even airplanes. When you stroll the streets of downtown, you can almost envision the bustling village in times past in the active downtown. 2 gentlemen from history share their stories with us now. Let's take a look.
William and Electa Hibbard Hakes, 1826 to 1905 and 1828 to 1912, a relative of Benjamin Gardner, William brought his family to Northville in 1870, where he was a carpenter by trade. They celebrated 58 years of married life.
Good afternoon. I'm William Hakes. I was a carpenter for many years here in Northville. And then you may say, well, I don't look much like a carpenter. Well, later in life I put away my tools and became a business investor. But I was born in 1826 back in Massachusetts, and I lived in Vermont for a number of years. When I was back there at age 21, I married my wife, Electa. We moved to Northville in 1870. I worked as a carpenter, built many of the fine homes in Northville, saved up some money, $3,000, and I was able to buy a nice piece of land on Dunlop Street from Benjamin Gardner, a relative of mine. Now, my land was at the far east end of Dunlap, across from what you now call a drive-through bank, whatever that is. The land where my house was is now a parking lot. And my address was 2 Dunlap. Now, we've got an address here that says 128 East Dunlap. Well, I'll tell you what happened. I was 2 Dunlap because I was right at the beginning of Dunlap where it started at Hutton. Well, they got this bright idea to renumber things from Center Street, West Dunlap and East Dunlap. So I somehow became 128 East Dunlap. But you know, in my mind, I'm still 2 Dunlap, right where it started. At any rate, my wife Electa, a lot of people mispronounced her name. They called it Electra, which is a little more common. But I told her that's because she had such a magnetic personality. Electromagnetic, you engineers know about that. I also said it fit because she was the light of my life. Well, we had 5 children, all born while we were still back in Vermont. The first one, we got married at 21, and at 22, Edna was born. Edna got married back east. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, so she got divorced and came to Northville and had to work as a servant to make ends meet for a while. Well, then later on, she and her younger brother, Theodore, moved back east and then ended up in Imlay City, where she lived with him. So that was sort of her life. About 4 years later, our first son, Theodore, was born, and he worked as a foreman in a woodworking factory in Detroit. When his wife passed away, he moved back east, as I said, with his older sister, and then on to Imlay City, where he became a cabinet maker. So I guess he got his woodworking skills from me. Our third child, Ellen, we called her Ella, married an interesting guy, Aaron Taft. Now, the Taft family owned a lot of land west of Taft's Road, 250 acres. And Aaron Taft later also became marshal of the village. I've always kind of wondered what it would have been like to be arrested on Taft Road by Marshal Taft. I don't know, it just kind of struck me as humorous. Well, unfortunately, our fourth child, who was born about 3 years later, Walter, died at an untimely age of 15 of scarlet fever. He's buried here with us, and that was quite a tragedy. Well, about 4 years later, our youngest son, William, was born. Now, you've probably noticed a pattern here. Every 3 to 5 years, it seems like our family grew. At any rate, we were really proud of William. He was the drum major in the Northville City Band. There he is with his big high hat. Isn't it impressive? Now, the city band used to play all around the area, but my favorite place was at the corner of Center and Main Streets. They had what they called the Crow's Nest, and it was a big platform right out in the middle of the street. And the band used to get up there and play, and people would come from all over. That was a grand thing. We were very proud of him. Well, as I said, later in life I had saved up some money, and so I put my tools away, bought up some land, and sold land, became an investor. And when they came to call on me for the census, they said, "What's your occupation?" And I said, "I'm a capitalist." And that's what they wrote down, capitalist. Well, in '05, I passed away at age 79 from a heart attack. My wife, Electa, passed away 7 years later at age 84. But you know, the Lord gave us long and fruitful lives and 5 wonderful children. So thank you for your interest in our family. Thank you.
Edward Kellogg, 1819 to 98, a farmer who was also in the business of buying property and building tenement houses all over Northville. He outlived 2 wives and died at Eloise.
Good afternoon. My name is Edward P. Kellogg, and I was a well-known resident and businessman in Northville. I was born June 3rd, 1819, in Manchester, Ontario County, New York. In 1842, I married my wife, Sarah Sattard, when I was 23 years old. We had 2 daughters, Helen and Flora, and we had 2 sons, William and Henry. Unfortunately, our sons died, and they were buried in New York. It was hard on my wife, and it also affected me. In 1849, Sarah and I began to discuss maybe we would move from New York. We had found out that there was land plentiful and cheap in Michigan. And so we booked on a packet boat from Albany on the Erie Canal, and 8 days later arrived in Buffalo. 2 days later, after taking a steamship to Detroit, we were able to stop at the land office and buy 40 acres in Lyon Township, Oakland County, Michigan. I was proud to say when the census taker came to my house in September of 1850 that my farm was worth $2,000, a goodly sum at that time. By 1860, we were doing well enough that we were able to hire a servant. Mary and her daughter stayed with us and helped with Flora and Helen, and also helped Sarah with the chores. Unfortunately, in 1861, as the Great War of the Rebellion was beginning, the angel of death visited us again and took my wonderful wife Sarah from me at the age of only 40 years old. Helen at that time was 18 and Flora was 6, and so Helen became the lady of the house. I remained a bachelor until 1865, and then I married my second wife, Mary Northrop. She was 25 years younger than I, but we never had any children, so I had no one to leave my name to. As the 1860s went on, I bought more land in Northville and also built houses. The Reverend James Cox of the First Baptist Church lived in one of my houses. By 1870, as the census taker returned to my house in Lyon Township, I was proud to say that my farm was now worth $25,000, a very goodly sum at that time, and my personal wealth was $14,000, most of that from land and houses that I owned in Northville. So as the 1870s moved on, I also bought a cooper business, and my friend Wilkins, it was Wilkins and Kellogg Cooperage, we put out 200 barrels a day. And I decided it was time to move into town. And so I bought a lot on Dunlap Street for $325. I wonder if that was the right price. Oh well. And I built a house at 401 Dunlap in the year 1873. I added to it over time, and in the year 1888, actually spent $1,000 on an addition. I later lived on Main Street and Center Street at different times. By 1880, my farm was still worth $25,000, still more than most of the farms around me. I wanted to tell you some detail about my farm, but I decided that maybe that was bragging. So suffice to say that I had a horse and I had a mule. I had oxen, I had some swine. I had chickens that gave me eggs and sheep that gave me wool. And I grew wheat and I grew rye and I had apple trees. But we all grow older. And in the year 1895 in September on a Sunday, I was struck with an attack of nervous prostration and laid low in my bed. I mustered enough strength a few days later to go to Lansing by train because I had received word that my wife, Mary, was laid low with no hope of recovery. Within 2 days when I was there, the angel of death visited her and took her away from these earthly sufferings. I myself was growing ill also, and in 1897 I went to the Wayne County home, which you may know as Eloise. And in 1898, Dr. Bennett sent a letter to my daughter Flora and said that I had suffered a complete loss of memory. Burying 2 little boys and 2 wives is best not remembered. With that, I thank you and I bid you adieu.
Thank you for taking the time to hear a little bit about Northville's past, illustrated by these life stories. I believe knowing our past is crucial to projecting our future and where we want to go. I fully encourage you to learn even more about our community's history here at the Millrace Village and the library. Take some time to appreciate our Victorian heritage as you stroll the neighborhoods and our downtown. Keep that Northville faith.
Kurt Kimber, we were born just 3 days apart, although opposite ends of the country. His family comes to Northville during his freshman year. He graduates in '67, goes off to college, returns and accepts a teaching position in the English department here at Northville High. That spring, he directs the first of his musicals, and that was Guys and Dolls, the first of many here at Northville. The following year, I come to Northville and join the faculty, and it seemed that our paths were always destined to cross. During track season, he helped out, along with his adopted son, Tony. He would run the timing device and also organize volunteers to help with the picking of the times and the places. Sometimes we'd run a few volunteers short, and he'd walk over to the fence line and convince total strangers to join him, offering them the best seat in the house. Now, he could have been a great salesman, but Kurt was an even better storyteller. Each fall during Victorian Festival, he would enthrall endless gaggles of excited third graders with tales of America's past. During Christmas, he would allow his beard to grow out and assume the role I think he was meant to play, which would be jolly old St. Nick. Now, to kind of continue this description of Clement Clark more, Kurt's droll sense of humor was always on display, especially when he was the voice of the Mustangs for basketball and football games, where a penalty for illegal procedure might become backfield shenanigans. Now, as time goes on, as the decades roll on, Kurt and I found more times to sort of meet just informally, talk about the events of the day. People of a certain generation experience at least one significant event in their past where they knew vividly where they were at that time. Like Kurt, I was the new kid in school during my freshman year too. New school, new town. And as Thanksgiving approaches, he and I think at the same time heard the sad news from Dallas that President Kennedy had been taken from us. Now, Kurt and I had never talked about death or anything like this, and I have to believe that given the choice, he would want to remain with friends and family. But Kurt was someone who was always an optimist, and I think he would probably look upon November 22nd and consider it an auspicious cue for him to exit the stage.